It's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And we know that a lot of people have not been happy with what the Labour government has done in the last 12 months. We know that a lot of Labour people are not happy with what's happened in the last 7 days. And tomorrow, actually, on the programme, we will hear from a cross-section of some voters about what they make of it. But that is all to come. Today, as you said, we are getting out our dusty old crystal balls. Let us try thinking about policy rows coming ahead, personnel changes, possibly, and what the politics might be this time next year in summer 2026.
So Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who has been at the centre of all the things we're not talking about, because they're in the past.
Verboten.
She's given an interview to The Guardian.
She has.
When she has signalled, she has flashed the headlights at the prospects of tax rises.
She has. And that is partly, but I might say not entirely, a product of the Labour shenanigans over welfare, and giving up on that policy means that Rachel Reeves has got even less cash to spend, notional cash, to make her figures add up. Probably the biggest political event of the next 12 months is going to be the autumn budget, probably in November sometime. We don't have a fixed date yet. And even before the whole snafu over welfare and the government backing down in the face of that backbenchers, it was already the case, and you've correctly said it, reminded us of this lots of times, that Rachel Reeves was looking as if she might already be a bit strapped. And she is, I think it's interestingly, really quite publicly acknowledging that now. You know, they're not kind of saying, oh, no, we're not going to do anything. They're saying, yes, financial implications.
Yes, I'm going to say two things. One is about the policy that we think will go next, which is any change to the two-child benefit cap.
Yes.
And then I'd like to cast back to this newscast, which said before the general election, anyone who won, any government was going to have to put up taxes. That's on the record. There are many podcasts.
Said it again and again.
There are a million
again and again. Yeah.
But we're the one who said that. Whoever wins.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to deploy my maths A-level now.
Oh.
Liz Truss paid my gas bill.
She did.
The Conservative government did furlough during COVID.
Yes.
The whole country was paid to stay at home, and freelancers weren't paid. So there's listeners who weren't paid, but there was a huge, huge bill that was paid for. Then whoever came in is going to pick up that tab. Labour came in with the unusual hand behind the back technique, which is on them, of saying they won't pull the three main levers. And
Correct.
That takes us to today.
It does take us to today. Question now, with Rachel Reeves still says she doesn't want to put up income tax. She still says she doesn't want to touch VAT, and she doesn't want to touch national insurance that workers pay. Where else is she going to get a lot of money to try to make ends meet come the autumn? I do think it's also worth saying, look, the welfare changes, or the welfare not changes, have not made a transformational change to the balance sheet. What we're really talking about is the overall economic picture, where Rachel Reeves doesn't have very much wriggle room. But the much bigger issues are going to be whether or not the economy shows any convincing signs of growth, other than a measly little bit here and there. What happens in the international economy as a result of whatever Donald Trump does about his tariffs and his trade war with China, and whether that's on or off. What happens in the Middle East? What happens to oil prices? But talking to people in Labour in the last few weeks about this, as the anniversary was approaching, the biggest issue for them is what happens to the economy writ large, and what the implications are for that in terms of the political decisions writ small.
So do we have to wait to the autumn?
Yes, without question. And we are all newscasters going to have endless speculation, as we're doing right at this very minute. But someone senior in the government said to me last week, look, actually, don't bake in that we're definitely going to have to do tax rises. They weren't denying for a second that was an option. But they were saying, look, actually, in other words, I think they were trying to say, you guys are going to be wasting your time if you spend 3 months talking about nothing other than whether or not we're going to do tax rises, because they will be striving not to have to raise taxes. And they are very, very, very dependent on factors beyond their control in terms of what happens to the overall economy. But don't forget, looming over all of this, which we perhaps don't talk about enough, is the size of the national debt and the interest payments thereon. So Westminster conversation is so often dominated by, this bit of policy over here that might be a couple of billion, and this bit of policy over here that might be a couple of billion. But the cost of the debt and interest rates and how that affects the enormous amounts that the government has to spend on paying those debts that you were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, that is such an important determining factor for what's going to happen in the next 12 months.
So can we say any policy at all? I've mentioned two-child benefit cap, which Keir Starmer said he'd look at lifting the cap on benefits, plural. It's not child benefit, it's benefits, plural.
And it's tax credits, actually. It's completely misleading. And maybe we should start an attempt to rebrand, to rename this whole debate, because it's not a cap on child benefit.
What should we call it? Capped credits.
Capped credits or something. Let's call it something else.
So let's call it forevermore. I'll call it capped credits.
Let's call it capped credits.
Newscasters get a better one. So he can hardly raise spending effectively. He can hardly do that, can he?
Well, he can hardly raise spending, and they can hardly raise tax. But Labour does want to raise spending, and it may have to raise tax. So we know, though, overall, don't forget, we know from the spending review already the overall amount of money that government's going to spend for the next few years. And it's important that we all bear that in mind. So all that wanging on we did about the spending review a few weeks ago was well worth it, because that sets out the overall shape of what the government is planning to spend on all of those different things. But the two-child credit cap, see what I did there, is undoubtedly going to be a big political fight. And having backed down so much in the last few months is going to be very difficult for the government not to do what many of its backbenchers want it to do, although not necessarily what the polling bears out, but what many backbenchers want them to do, and prominent figures like Gordon Brown, which is remove the limit on the number of children in a household where that household can get certain types of benefits.
So, okay, we're going to move on from policy to politics and personnel, although I'll just say that I have said during this Parliament I believe income tax will go up. I've said that on this episode with you and Henry, so I'm sticking by that.
Before we move on, I do want to mention one other thing that I think might end up being a giant row inside the Labour Party is funding and provision for kids with special needs in England. So there is a row beginning to rumble. There's a white paper, so sort of draft laws coming from the Department for Education about this. It's been well discussed, and we all know how very, very nightmarish this can be for families trying to get the right help for their kids, either in their own school or trying to find the provision at a special school. We also know that the demand for that has gone up and up and up. The cost has gone up and up and up and up. So the Department for Education, who's admitted, and Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, who's with us tomorrow, she said many times the situation is, and I'm paraphrasing, a bit of a disaster. She's coming forward quite soon with her plans, and there are real nerves in the Labour Party about how this might land.
Okay.
Because they want to bring the bill down, but it's a very, very difficult area. And most importantly, they want to make the service better for families that really need it.
So there's a prediction of a stramash coming.
A stramash and a stooshy.
And a stooshy. So now we'll go to the politics. Why don't we listen to the Prime Minister? Because he sat down with Nick Robinson to discuss the first year, and he said that he and the government plan to stick to their guns.
One of the places I think you feel very comfortable and have always talked about, which is on the football pitch.
Yeah.
You know what they say about football managers. They say, he's lost the dressing room. Have you lost the Labour Party dressing room?
Absolutely not, Nick. I mean, there's as soon as we go through the long list of things that we've achieved this year, the Labour dressing room, the PLP, is proud as hell of what we've done. And their frustration, my frustration, is that sometimes the other stuff, welfare being an example, can obscure us being able to get that out there. But you'll be hearing a lot from me about that. But I can't tell you how proud we are as a party, as a parliamentary party, as a group of MPs together, of all that we've managed to do this year, and the lives of people that we have changed and improved and will continue. And we're only just starting. This, in a sense, is the toughest year. So we're only just beginning.
It's interesting. Labour MPs definitely are pleased about a lot of the things that have happened, but they are also extremely displeased by a lot of the things that happened. And I also just don't think that Keir Starmer is likely at any point to walk into the Labour dressing room, metaphorically, in the next 12 months and find out that he's universally loved. And I think part of what we've seen since they've been in office that's not going to change in the next 12 months is there's never has been this big love affair between Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. He has respect for many quarters. He took the thing by the scruff of the neck from an impossible situation and got them into a situation where they got this huge majority. They got into government, but it's never been a big love story.
So we're talking about the next 12 months. So we say he doesn't gain more love from the PLP.
And it could get worse.
Could get worse.
It may well get worse. And don't forget, and let's start this conversation now about May 2026. What happens in May 2026? Another huge set of English local elections, including some of the elections that were delayed this year. But elections in cities like Birmingham, where, hello, big bin strike, newscasters, if you live in Birmingham, tell us it's still going on, still unresolved. Huge elections for the Welsh Senate. Reform fancies their chances there at winning and potentially running the Welsh government, the Welsh Senate, that has powers over lots of important services there. Holyrood elections also in Scotland. So I think that's going to feel like a sort of big set of American midterms. And even, and I say this advisedly, because when you put this to people at the top layers of the Labour Party, they say, oh, that's demented, it's bananas. There are, however, people in Labour who say if that goes badly, if those elections all go badly, Keir Starmer's leadership might become a live question. So at the moment it's whispers, right? Whispers around the edges. Oh, it's all been a bit difficult and people don't like Starmer and the polling is terrible and hasn't all been awful. And you get the odd person saying, well, if it wasn't Keir Starmer, then, you know, maybe we'd have a better shot. But people who are, how should I put this delicately? People who are not crackers say that after next May, right, if the results are dreadful for Labour, it could, others predict, become a live question about whether or not he's the person to take them into the next election. I'm not predicting that there's going to be anything like a contest, but it was astonishing to me that at this stage in the cycle, that's even a conversation taking place.
So that's, we're going to park that personnel, because you've said the biggest thing so far, which is about the next 12 months leadership question. So we're doing personnel in a second. Just on politics,
yes, we
must talk about Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, because there was a bit of a kind of misfire where it launched on Twitter or
yes,
X, saying it's going to be co-led and Jeremy Corbyn's going to co-lead it. He went silent about the whole thing because it looked like it hadn't been coordinated.
Yes.
So do we have a party on the left co-founded by him?
At 17 minutes past 3 on Saturday afternoon on the 5th of July. No, we don't yet. I think in the next few months, I think there's going to be a thing. It's likely in the next couple of weeks. Maybe even today, there was a big rally in London. So who knows, by tomorrow's newscast, we might have more of an idea. It's possible that over the next 12 months, there might be a party, a coming together of some of those independent MPs who beat people like Jonathan Ashworth in the election last year, some independent, often former Labour councillors around the country, and then maybe a sprinkling of left-wing MPs. It's possible there's a coming together that does that for a while and then actually even breaks up by this time next year. It's possible also that you might get even some Greens pulled into that kind of grouping. Zach Polanski, who's trying to become the next leader of the Green Party, he talks about becoming an eco-populist. He's sort of hinted that he might be willing to work with that kind of grouping. But I think it's very, very unpredictable. And what we've seen so far, where something kind of launched but then didn't really launch, and then does it launch and then don't know, it doesn't suggest at this stage that there's a super coherent, solid plan.
And if it did, then Nick Watt on Newsnight told me it could expect about 10% support from the current thinking of how the pollsters go.
That's what the polling suggests.
So we put that in our markers. We're making predictions. Mm-hmm. So we say predict a new party which could attract up to 10% of the support.
Possibly.
Okay.
But the impact that would have on the other parties is also really interesting to imagine, because if you're Labour, you know already that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of seats in the general election where the Reform Party were in second place. So you can see in some policy areas how Labour's been trying to respond to where they see a lot of political demand and opinion moving, which is more in the Reform territory than looking the other way over to the further reaches of the left. So what do they do in those circumstances will be very interesting.
In this section, you've predicted big implications from the May 2026 elections.
Yeah.
We've also spoken about the forming of a new party in the next 12 months and the support it could form. We're now going to talk about political management in number 10 Downing Street. Now, I'm limited here a bit because the rules say I can't talk very much looking in the rearview mirror, because that was the way we agreed to go.
It's not allowed.
It's not allowed. So let's assume that we start anew.
Yeah.
I think they would like to start anew, because although I can't talk about the past, it has not, the politics has, they've not won an A star for the politics of it. They've been said in the unmentionable bit to have done this badly. So I think they would like the recess to be a reboot of how they run number 10 and number 11, say I.
I think it's true that there is what was described to me as a full wash-up going on, right, after the recent sort of shambles.
You can't mention it.
Sorry. There is a full wash-up, as was described to me, going on. And I know that there is a lot of thinking about how they can make things work better. Do they have the right structures in number 10? Do they have the right people? Should they get in more advisors? Should they boot up number 10, which I know often, and this government is no stranger to that, people arrive in and they go, oh, it doesn't work very well. And you know, if I had a hot dinner for every time someone in politics has said to me, did you know that working in an 18th century Georgian townhouse isn't very conducive to the way that people like to run things in modern times? And actually, the physicality of number 10 is, it can be a problem. And it means that people are working in different bits of the building when they were used to during a Labour campaign. Will there be changes and things that make sense on paper in number 10? Yes, I think that's likely. But will the bigger thing happen? Here's the bigger, and I think the most important thing, or the more important thing, as has been expressed to me by a few people this week who are sort of, I would say, kind of benign forces around who want Keir Starmer to do well, but they're not uncritical, right? They've said to me, several people who know their onions have said to me, what actually number 10 needs to do is look in the mirror. Not go on and on about structures and not look at this, that and the other and how can we make it better, but actually look at their own performance. How does Keir Starmer go about making decisions? How does he treat his party? How does he prioritise? And whether you can make changes to yourself as a leader is a much harder thing to do than, you know, mess around with structures and things like that in Whitehall. I'm not saying those things don't matter, but Keir Starmer is often praised by his allies for being someone who learns, who is self-reflective, who said, OK, I didn't get that right. And they say, look, after a Hartlepool by-election, he changed various things in the party. Whether he can change, as many people believe he ought to, how he works as Prime Minister, that's a much, much bigger question.
So in the next 12 months, and in fact in the next 12 weeks, because that'll be, they go on recess and they come back from recess, look for a new primary colour. Look for something that says, they've done some work on presentation, communication, party management. Look for something. Someone will call it a reboot. We can predict that coming.
Oh, we can completely.
So we predict that. Now we go to personnel.
Yes.
So you've done the biggest one, which is that if 2026 goes badly in Scotland, Wales and England, it's a leadership question.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that will happen. I'm
No.
not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I have been surprised in my conversations this week with people who are not on the crazy margins of politics that has been mooted as something as a possible conversation.
And I say Rachel Reeves is currently welded as if by a blowtorch to the Prime Minister, that for some reason newscasters can only guess at. Her position is stronger this Saturday than it was last week, in the sense that not that she hasn't got these dreadful, difficult decisions to make, but he has put his project closer to her in the past few days. So do we predict, and Henry Zeffman has done, that there is debate about her even presenting the next budget? Has that ebbed with the result, with what's happened recently, or do we still say it's an open question about the Chancellor in the next 12 months?
Well, look, I think there's always an open question about personnel in the Cabinet because politics moves very quickly, things can go wrong, all sorts of things that we can never imagine have happened. However, I think we should always remember how central she was to the whole of the Starmer opposition journey into power. Once she became Shadow Chancellor, things sort of really started to change. He has often, and some people say this is a criticism, but economics is not Keir Starmer's thing. Some people would say that he's sort of deferred to her when it comes to economics. And after the wobble this week, also the markets wobbled when they thought she might be going. So it's very difficult to separate them as a political project.
It is, isn't it?
And I don't think we should underestimate that. And Keir Starmer's not somebody also who really goes in for change's sake. So look, there's always speculation about a reshuffle. It's one of sort of Labour's favourite games. I don't get a sense, and this will probably mean it'll happen next week, but I was asking people this week and said, would it be foolish to ignore the possibility of a reshuffle happening sometime soon? And they said, no, well, we're really just not thinking about that in any way. And it wouldn't be very on brand, because don't forget also, and I'm going to talk about the past, continuous Tory reshuffles was one of the things that Keir Starmer used to criticise all the time. He came in with a determination to give people time in their jobs. But look, I think also the biggest determinant of whether or not Rachel Reeves stays in that job is what happens to the economy, less than the politics.
So we have to say there is a question over the Chancellor in the next 12 months because of the scale of the earlier remarks we've made. Scale of the challenge. Yeah. So it would be very unusual to tackle a mountain of that size without a risk. So we know there's a risk to her position. We also know that he has bolted himself to her closer in the last few days than in, say, a month ago.
I mean, he said, she'll be here for next year and forever and ever.
When the sands of time have blown across the beaches, there she'll be. He didn't actually say that. So personnel behind the scenes. Yep. So Morgan McSweeney has become the story, which you're not meant to do in that role.
Yes, although, you see, I would always look at it slightly differently. It can be incredibly convenient for prime ministers to have a controversial, well-known chief of staff, because if things go wrong, there's always somebody then with a public profile who can have to leave before you do. I mean, it's the sort of Rasputin character, isn't it? And I'm not saying that Morgan McSweeney is like Rasputin, but it can be incredibly useful for a prime minister to have another political figure who can be used as a sort of a bit of a lightning rod, because it stops people slagging them off.
But if we've just predicted in the second section that there'll be a sort of reboot,
yes,
then surely you'll have to bring someone new in to the back office or boot someone out from the back office. So I think we might as well be brave and say there will be changes to personnel in the engine room, but we're not going to predict who, but we can say, yes, there will be.
I think look, in any year period, there's nearly always going to be changes in number 10.
Well, that's why I'm saying
But I think that's what's maybe more likely is that you get a beefed up number 10 rather than actually, I would, some people would say, look, there's no Keir Starmer without Morgan McSweeney. And I wouldn't necessarily say that, because obviously Keir Starmer existed as a human being before Morgan McSweeney was attached to his political side. But, he's not a sort of Johnny-come-lately who turned up on day one or turned up 6 months before the election. He's somebody who's an absolutely core part of the Starmer project. So it's a bit different to the sort of, Dominic Cummings' brother, Boris Johnson, or Dominic Cummings sort of comes in as a hired hand, knowing that he's going to come in and be controversial and try to smash things up, or at least say he's going to try and smash things up. But there's no sense that they were sort of in it together from the start. This is it's a different kind of relationship. If you're being really nerdy, and I know newscasters like this kind of stuff, where it's been suggested to me the bigger gap might be is if you look at Keir Starmer's progress on foreign policy, a lot of people would say, oh, yes, he's done that jolly well. Let's say, yes, tick, tick. Oh, Jonathan Powell, very experienced advisor who's been in charge of that. Then the next sentence is, and on the domestic side, there isn't one person who has taken a similar sort of grip of what's going on policy-wise at home. Doesn't mean there isn't anyone, there are, but there's a kind of, who's in charge of that bit, and it feels a bit less clear.
Predictions, I think, look for wins that they can trumpet. Delivery. Alan Johnson, the former a post-holding cabinet member, was on Broadcasting
As
House.
well as delivering the post once upon a
That's
time.
right. And I said,
Yeah.
it's all about delivery, isn't it? And he said, don't talk to me about delivery. I used to be a postman.
And you said, boom, boom.
I said, boom, boom. I want to add that here, so that say a deal is done on small boats with the French that cuts small boat crossings.
Yep.
Say that waiting appointment times goes down demonstrably to everyone's audit, not
Yes.
just to a political press release.
Yes.
Say that there is growth.
Yes.
Then you see a whole new swagger in the step.
You do. And there is a best case scenario.
So we put that out there.
There absolutely is a best case scenario. And when you talk to people at top level of government, this is basically what they say, is that just hold on tight. We still think that it's probably going to be okay. We see some early indicators that NHS progress might take on more potency. It was very interesting, and people will see it on the telly tomorrow, but I've spent this morning with a group of voters in Kent who all voted Labour last time. Now they're very disappointed. However, the sense was a grudging willingness to give them more time, not the door has been slammed.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you've done that work. I haven't. And I think, no, because I think it's important. And I think what we're saying in this bit of the podcast is there is reason for this government to improve. There are ways for it to improve in the next 12 months. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Goodbye.